So welcome to the first core lecture. I call that Embodied Cognition. And you'll see that it is very much about how we link dynamical neural fields to sensory information and to motor information. So there's one magic element of neurodynamics is always this u dot equals minus u, this equation here. That is sort of, in the end, you will be totally familiar with it and you will be almost fed up with it because it's always u dot equals minus u. And it's a bit magic. If you, Stephen Grossberg, who is perhaps the intellectual grandfather of this field, in his papers, he suddenly writes down this u dot equals minus u, comes out of nowhere in some sense. And that will be important because you will be seeing that when we have these neurodynamic equations where u dot is the rate of change, the derivative of u in time, then on the right-hand side, we'll have all kinds of inputs, like in neural network, inputs and positive, excitatory, inhibitory, and so on. And neural inputs, of course, always have only one sign. They're excitatory or the inhibitory. So minus u is a little bit different, right? Minus u is odd there. It's not an input. It is state dependence. And so where does it come from? There are different ways to talk about that. And the way I'm talking here about that is to say it ultimately really comes from what some people call the neurophysics of neurophysiology. That is the properties of neurons as electrical elements, the membrane. And these membranes maintain action potential, intracellular potential, and I will be briefly motivating this from that level. So this is like just a few slides, and that will then give me an opportunity to introduce attractor dynamics in a more general way. And at this stage, it will be just that one part. And that I have these little blue markers here that give you a survey of what's to come. And so this will be the first unit that will just understand where that minus u comes from. So here is an illustration from a textbook, very good textbook, by the way, that illustrates the intracellular potential of a neuron. When you record from inside the membrane, you find that the electric potential inside is a bit negative, and that negative potential can be moved around by inserting some current somewhere along the axon, or can work anywhere on the neuron. Inserting some current, and you will see that the membrane then transiently reacts to that current. And you can sort of see from the way that this relaxes here, the time scale of that membrane, which is about 10 milliseconds, as you see here. And mathematically, behavior like that will be characterized by a differential equation of this nature. This is a simplification, or there are more detailed equations that take into account the details ionic currents in that, ions being transported across the membrane. That's why it's called neurophysics. And the rough summary of that is that you have a rate of change of this intracellular potential that is, has a minus u term, which means it creates a stable state. I'll come to that. And that generates a characteristic time scale, because the solutions of equations like that are exponential time courses. And so you kind of guess here the exponential time course. This is the on course and off, on and off, on, and something happens here that I'll come to. And so then when I talk about a time scale, it's with respect to these exponential time courses that follow from this membrane equation. This is the equation that integrated fire models use, a rough simplification of the complex neurophysics of the membranes. And the notion of fire comes from the fact that there's a threshold. So when this potential exceeds a certain threshold, then an event will be emitted in the shape of this action potential, this positive, less negative, or it's actually positive membrane potential is somewhat invariant. Doesn't really matter how far and fast you went through the threshold, and then it returns to sub-threshold. I'll say more about that in a moment. Typically, you see the threshold only if you get multiple inputs. So these little inputs inserted here mimic what inputs coming from the dendrites would actually do it to the neuron, then you get that spike event. And there's actually interesting constraints about these inputs having to overlap in time enough. And it's very clear that they have to overlap enough so that the effect they had on the membrane hasn't dissipated yet. So it's about 10 milliseconds is that time scale that requires spikes to overlap. And that's an aspect that is not really treated well in DFT, that's treated in the spiking neural networks. So the level of firings, or how fast neurons fire, is a function of how much input the cells get. That's called rate code. It is important to keep in mind that these times are still really pretty large between these different spikes. So this is 100 milliseconds here. So you have here, might have something like 30 milliseconds between spikes. It's quite long if you think of behavior occurring on a time scale of 150 milliseconds, for instance. Now, in neurodynamics as well, it's sometimes called mean field theory and a lot of connections networks and so on. We're actually not looking at these spike events. We're saying that spiking events are sort of microscopic detail of how neural activity is generated, and we're substituting that spiking mechanism by a sort of effective description or approximate description where we just pass the activation through a threshold function, we call a sigmoid threshold function. So that's 0 for sufficiently negative activation and 1 or some constant for sufficiently positive activation. These activation variables are then in some sense more abstract. It's no longer really the actual membrane potential. It's some variable that characterizes how close the neuron is to firing. It's actually then how close a population of neurons is to creating a volley of activation in the population. And so we typically normalize these variables so that the threshold is at 0. And the exact meaning, what the units of activation is then relative to that sigmoid. So if you have a softer sigmoid, then activations that extend further above and below 0 have different meaning. While if you have a sharp sigmoid, then as soon as you're beyond this activation level, there is no more influence on the downstream system, and the same on the negative side. So activation is an abstract variable, and it's ultimately probed by what the effect of any neural population is on downstream neurons. So downstream means that receive inputs from a neuron or neural population we'll be looking at. I will make this more concrete later in the lecture when I talk about population code. So ultimately, it's even the motor system. So ultimately, you will see motor action, and it will be measured through motor action, muscle activation, that will be the sign that something significant happened earlier. And so this notion, in this approximation, again, called mean field theory sometimes, only activation that passes through the sigmoid returns a non-zero value is transmitted to these neurons that a particular subpopulation projects onto. So that replaces the spiking mechanism, because only spikes are being transported to downstream neurons and have an impact on downstream neurons in the more detailed psychophysical picture. So that's sort of where the minus U term comes from, roughly. And we could sort of say that from what I will be talking about now, you could think of the U, the activation variable, being something like a population level membrane potential, but renormalized a little bit. It's not population level spike rate, which would be a strictly positive number. We're not looking at that. So let's forget that background and just take for granted that we will be taking this perspective. We'll be talking about neural activation as subject to this equation. Here's a plot of this equation. So minus U means there's negative slope here. Conventionally, because of the sigmoid, we'll think of this number H we add here is sort of like the normalization term. Call it resting level, because without anything, that would be where U dot is 0, right? If U dot is 0, then that's the 0 crossing here. We would have a constant solution of the neurodynamics. And if you put then U to the other side, you would say have U equals H. You're sitting here. And So that's where we call that the resting level. And that resting level is typically chosen to be negative because the sigmoid will then has a threshold at 0. So there will be no transmitting of activation when the system neuron is in the resting level. So it is inactive, doesn't impact on anything else. So this is a dynamical system. If you're not familiar with that notion, here's a very quick idea. That notion means that if you have any initial level of activation, then you know what the future will be by looking up the rate of change. So let's say if you're here, look up the rate of change. It's a negative number, so you know next time you're going to be a little bit to the left. You can look that up again, you'll be to the left. And these arrows here indicate the flow, that is the vector field, the direction in which there will be a change of activation when governed by the as it emerges from this neurodynamics. And same here on the negative axis, there's a positive rate of change, so everything will be positive. So one general idea is that these dynamical systems need an initial state. So there's an inner state of these neurons. It's not just a question of inputs, it's also a question of inner state. Here is not yet so obvious, we'll see that later. That is the initial condition, and the future is then determined by the dynamics. And inputs and so on will be part of the dynamics, but it's always the current state that predicts the future. Now, this is a specific dynamical system with a -u term. It has this stability property, and you already see that from these arrows that I was sort of derived from mental simulation. So you see from any initial activation here to the right, you will be converging to this fixed point, and from anyone here on the left, you'll be converging by increasing to this fixed point. The fixed point is a particular solution, the constant solution. So all these zero crossings of the dynamics, we call this function just the dynamics of them in jargon. So any of the zero crossings will be fixed points, that is constant solutions. You can compute that here, as I'm hinting, that postulate that the rate of change at the fixed point is 0, then you can dissolve that. I hinted at that earlier. And that's a fixed point, and a fixed point that attracts nearby solutions, so they converge to that, is called an attractor, or simply a asymptotically stable fixed point. And in the simple linear form, these solutions can actually be computed exactly in their exponential functions. So from any initial condition, you're going to converge in this way to the resting level. And these exponential functions have an exponent, so exponential minus t divided by tau. That means that within that time scale tau, you will reduce your initial distance from the resting level by e, the natural number, so it's about 2.7 something. So you could say, roughly speaking, you reduce your distance from the final state by to a third, or by 2/3. And so that's a very interesting property. That's a property that makes that the rate that the decay is independent of the initial condition if measured in percent. The 30 is just for convenience, but you could just say any percent change of the initial condition takes the same amount of time. It doesn't really matter what the absolute distance is. So for instance, this one changes to a third in the same time as this one changes to a third. And so in the future, next third is again takes again 1 unit of tau. That's called a time scale. That's not true for just any function that decays. For instance, 1/t or 1/t² would not be like that. So that's when we talk about time scales, we really mean this exponential relaxation. And this is a general property of the membranes, and so it's inherited by the entire brain coming from that. That's why we talk about the time scale of neural activity in the brain in this sense. So you also see from this plot that the fact that there is an attractor sort of organizes the solution. So mathematically, if you look at the future from all initial conditions, that's what actually mathematicians call the flow, and you can sort of have a visual impression here of the flow, that the entire initial line would, they all converge here to the endpoint. And it's a very simple kind of flow here, and we'll see more complex flows as we go along. So this is a very short introduction into dynamic systems and attractors, right? And from now on, we'll be working with that, and we'll be complicating it by inputs and then by interaction and by, we'll look into instabilities. Good. So in this picture of neurodynamics, inputs are contributions to the rate of change. So there's an input here. I'm added that. If it's a positive input, I call that excitatory input. If it's a negative input, it's an inhibitory input. And the input comes from somewhere here. I'm suggesting it maybe comes from the sensory surface, or it could come from some previous neurons. I'll talk more about that later. And we know in neurophysiology that the neurons only either excite or only either inhibit, so they don't change sign. The synapses have a fixed sign, either positive or negative. And so inputs can different. If you have excitatory, it will be a different input that makes inhibitory. And so what does that mean? So if that was the dynamics we just looked at, that means if I have an excitatory input, it will lift up that line, right? It's a contribution, and that whole line is shifted up. See, this is an input that doesn't depend on you. It's an external input. It lifts up that line, and you see the attractor is then shifted from this negative resting level to something positive. And if you apply an input like that, then the activation will relax exponentially to the new value specified by that input. And the sigmoid, sometimes we're using the letter G for the sigmoid. The sigmoid will be sort of a, some sharpening of that, because only once activation is positive, the sigmoid will start returning, and the sigmoid saturates at some level. That will be what is transmitted to downstream systems. And so that's a basic change. If you think of neural networks, then often in neural networks, people think, well, the output equals the some function of the input. And so it's a unique functional relationship, but that doesn't really work in recurrent neural networks. We'll be getting to that. And neurodynamics is different. In neurodynamics, you say the rate of change is a function of the input. And so the solution is then the solution of the differential equation of the dynamical system. So here I'm just clarifying that unfortunately in our book and our papers, we're using sometimes G of U and sometimes sigma of U. Somebody complained that we're using sigma in multiple contexts, and G was free, but it's more typical to call the sigmoid sigma of U, right? Even though we also use sigma for other purposes. So we're not totally consistent with that, unfortunately. But it's maybe clear enough what a sigmoid is. So far, as you see, this is really just doing low-pass integration, right? You low-pass filtering. You have the input is this dark blue line. That's the time course, and then you will be getting ultimately out of that the light blue line. That will be the sigmoid. So it's just smooth, slightly smooth. At this very steep sigmoid, it isn't even smooth so much. So it's not so important what the dynamics does so far, but you will soon see that it can become more important. I wanted to use this occasion to introduce you to the simulator that I will be using. And this is one of the simulators. You have available on the webpage. You can play with that. So this simulator has two single neurons, one here on top, one here on bottom. Here they are plotted against each other. Currently, I only need one of those two neurons. And you see here the time course of the neuron. This activation against time is actually running all the time. It's currently at -5, which is the resting level. This is the dynamic. So this is the rate of change as a function of activation. Here is the zero origin of the coordinate system. It has a zero crossing with a negative slope at -5 that comes from the resting level being -5. I can move that around. You see. I see it's following my resting level. I have another button here where I can actually vary the input strength in addition, right? And you see it is just following my input. It's just sort of tracking the input. I'm not actually plotting the sigmoid right now, so you don't see any effect of that, right? So that's a tool we'll be using in a moment. Good. I think you should be back to seeing my slides if I did everything correctly. Good. Good. So that was just a very simple low-pass filtering. Just to make it explicit, I already hinted at that. So the abstraction with this activation variable and so on is the same as used in connections networks. So the difference is that those talk about neurons as being functions. Now, output is a function of input, while we're thinking of neurons as dynamical systems. So the output is, in this case, low-pass filter of the input, because nothing special happened yet, but in a moment you'll see that we can do much more. Good. So what we'll now do is we'll look at neural fields ultimately, and what we'll do is go from just forward connectivity, and from that we'll derive a notion of a map, and then we'll neglect the discrete sampling by neurons, and that's how we'll end up with fields and feature values being represented in the fields. And then I'll return to neurodynamics for fields. So here's the neural network. So we're dealing with discrete neurons of the kind of variables I just looked at, and in a way there are notions, and these are shared with connectionism, that neural networks like that, that neurons in neural network like that stand for something, and they stand for something by virtue of the forward connectivity. So you could say, for instance, that this neuron stands for the input S1 in the sense it will be active when S1 is present, and this one stands for S2, and so on. And so then this neuron, depending on what the nature of this connectivity is, could stand for some combination of S1 and S2, and this one stands for some combination of S2 and S3, and so on. And this kind of interpretation of what neurons express is sometimes called space code, or also labeled line code. And that notion comes from the space refers to where you are within the neural network. So you think of the neural activation as just being some kind of indicator that a certain part of the neural network was activated, and the activation itself is really not what carries the information, it's where you are in the network that carries the information. And that's a notion that we'll be using a lot in neurodynamic fields. It's an interpretation of the neural activation pattern with respect to, for instance, what caused the activation, or also with respect to what the activation causes as it projects down the neural network. And the other notion is that the rate of firing, or the activation level, rate of firing in the sort of biophysical, neurophysical picture, and in our sense will be the activation level, that stands for something. So familiar. So for instance, you might be familiar with the fact that sensory neurons often have a property that they are sensitive to some physical thing, like photoreceptors, let's say, would be sensitive to light intensity, and maybe hair cells in the cochlea or on the skin might be sensitive to pressure or to the frequency of sound, and then their firing rate would be some function, for instance, a monotonic function of that physical thing, of that physical intensity. And so that's an encoding in the sense that if you have a higher level of activation, you could infer that there must have been a higher level of intensity. Different intensities stand for higher levels, for different levels of firing, or different levels of activation. So what stands for something is the rate that stands for something. So in not all neural network modelers and theoreticians really talk about these as separate things. And the reason for that is that generic neural networks may be combining these two things all the time. And we'll look at that in later cases. For us, it will be a difference, because once you have translated some inputs into neural fields, you will see later, there is some kind of normalizing effect of the neural field. So the activation level itself will not actually be very sensitive to inputs. And so in that sense, in the dynamical field thinking that we'll be developing, the space code idea will be more prominent than the rate code idea, even though in the periphery, at the beginning and the end, rate code will play a role. So what I want to do now is take this kind of picture and generalize it. And this is the notion of a neural map. So let's think we have a sensory surface. And I'm talking about the surface of an abstract thing, but you can think of the retina as a surface. You can think of the skin as a surface. You can think of the cochlea as a surface. And you know that on different places on the cochlea, you have hair cells that have different physical properties, so that they are best driven by sound of different frequencies. And so, for instance, the frequency would be a feature dimension that is part of a sensory surface. And then on the skin, you have also actually different receptor types. In the eye, you have photoreceptors of different types, for instance, for color opponency. So sensor surface is not just a physical surface, could also include some feature surface. And a priori, these sensory surfaces are still spanned by discrete sensor cells, potentially, but they have some form of matrix. That is, you know that some cells are further from other cells than others. So it's not just an arbitrary space, it's a space that has some metric organization, has a topology, a neighborhood relationship. And the notion would now be that there would be some forward connectivity that similarly extracts some other kind of dimension, for instance, a visual dimension like orientation or movement direction or something, that through some forward connectivity, which might have the property that neighbors in this space are neighbors in that space, in the function space. And so that's expressed here by some kind of regularity of these forward projections. That is a very common picture. It's related to the notion of tuning curves. So for instance, if you're observing a single neuron in a certain population and you vary the properties of the stimulus, then you would see that, for instance, this neuron will respond to a certain range of stimuli, not to stimuli that are very different from the neurons, from stimuli in this range. And this measure of this range would be the tuning curve. It's also sometimes known as the receptive field when it's the visual space that you're referring to. So that's what you would be observing here. As you vary the feature dimension, you observe a certain change of the firing rate. So this is this red way of looking at that, while the reverse way would be the point spread function, which we write down in the model. That is an explanation of that tuning curve, or the tuning curve could be thought of as a signature of that tuning curve. And so when you do that, you will end up with a map that says that any signal in this space can be represented by some activation pattern in that space with this neighborhood relationship being preserved. And that map is pretty much a neural field. The neural field is actually the step to say that we're neglecting that these spaces are sampled by discrete neurons. So very typically, certainly in sensory areas and also to some extent motor areas, these forward projections are strongly overlapping, so that neighboring sensory units project to overlapping populations, or conversely, if you look at any unit here, its input overlap with the inputs that a neighboring neuron experiences. And in fact, in visual cortex, you find that the dendritic trees of neighboring neurons overlap very strongly. And therefore, you have some form of continuity. That is, if you vary the stimulus, there will be a graded way of how targets are in the map are excited. And therefore, the discretization by neurons is possibly not functionally relevant. In fact, there is no single effect known in the psychophysical literature where you would see a signature of the discrete nature of the neurons in the original space. There is a more abstract argument for this, the population code argument that I'll make later, but this would be like a first approximation. So if you do that, then we can think of continuously many neurons that span that map, and then we would say this continuous population of neurons spans a certain dimension, a feature dimension, by virtue of these forward connections. So it's when I say this peak stands for a particular value of the dimension y, that's because it is wired up so that it extracts from this stimulus that dimension. It could be that x equals y, for instance, if it's just, for instance, retinal space to retinal space, but maybe there could be other kinds of feature extraction, and we'll see examples of that, like orientation or speed or so on. A very analogous argument can be made in the opposite direction. So if you have some activation field somewhere in the brain, for instance, the motor cortex, and that would project down onto ultimately muscles, then particular activations of neurons here will be associated with particular motor states. For instance, some of you might be familiar with the homunculus, where you are postulating that certain parts of the motor cortex, when they're excited, they will elicit muscle twitching. in particular places along the musculoskeletal system. If you look more closely, and I'll get to that at the end of today's lecture, the output is actually more a dynamical system, a motor dynamical system, which has an attractor state. It's not really just reading out some values. We'll get to that. But it's sort of an analogous idea that is the forward projection from a particular field to the ultimately the behavioral, I call these motor surfaces. It's a more abstract kind of thought. To the space of possible movements, let's say. Now, that would be a motor surface. That determines the meaning of this activation pattern. So when we write down fields, we often say it's a field over this or over that. But the way that comes about is by the forward projection from the field to the motor system or from a sensory system to the field. And these projections can go through multiple fields, and it will be a property of the architecture that makes sure that the field is really about that dimension. At the very end of these three core lectures, I will be coming back to that point about, why is it consistent that we really can say that this field is about a particular dimension. That's not trivial, but for now, let's take it for granted. Good. Okay, so that's how the fields come about, and that means that now we have a way of saying, when I look at an activation variable, the meaning of that variable is given by its sources of input and or the way that the activation projects downstream. Now, what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the dynamics in these systems, and that will be looking at activation that is not just determined by input. And I'll especially talk about interaction or coupling, and I'll introduce the two basic dynamical instabilities, detection and selection. From that, and I'll take that as just a single neuron, and then I'll take two neurons, and only then we'll actually look at fields in the next section. So here is the simplest neural network you could possibly build that is dynamic in nature. It's one neuron, one activation variable would be more appropriate. One activation variable that just talks to itself, that is, the output of this neuron is projecting excitatorily onto the neuron itself. So in the equation, there's a term added here where it's the same activation U that we're talking about here, passed through the sigmoid, which I return to call sigma here, with some positive strength C. It excites the same activation variable. So it is self-excitatory, you could say. So in reality, you'll be seeing this is really the variable, activation variable stands for a small population, typically in the brain, even just to make the approximation of the mean field theory correct, we'll talk about a small population. And this is the case where the population, different members of the population excite each other, and that can be summarized as saying, in effect, this is self-excitation, even though there are sometimes individual neurons in the brain that also really make synapses on themselves like that. So this is a case where you clearly need the dynamic picture, because if you have this kind of a very elementary loop, recurrent neural network, right? Because you can't order the connectivity to be feed forward. And you see that then you cannot say the output is a function of the input, because some of the inputs are a function of the output, right? So it's recurrent. It can't be resolved. And the way to resolve is just to say, well, the inputs were earlier inputs. So the output is a function of the earlier inputs. And often it's written down in this discrete way, like having a discrete time. And really, the mathematical, there is no discrete clock on neural networks, right? The spikes, if you think of the spiking picture, the spikes are, as we call, asynchronous. That is, they can occur at any moment. They're not on a grid of a clock cycle or so. And as a result of that, we really have to talk about it as a dynamic state, and that resolves this difficulty. So you see, this is a very simple dynamical description of a recurrent network like that. You don't need any past or future value, right? It's absorbed into this rate of change concept, which in a sense is the future pointing term of the equation. So let's go through that. You'll see that surprising properties arise from this. In fact, this little circuit contains the core of sequence generation already, of making events in the brain, and it's quite far-reaching. So this is what this dynamics looks like, right? It has the minus u term, and then you add the sigmoid, right? The sigmoid would be a function like that. So there is a contribution to the rate of change at positive u's, but not at negative u's. Some transition made it more or less smooth. So if you add these two curves, you get something like that, if I did that right? So for very negative values, you have this negative slope from the minus u term. And for very positive values, this is constant at some point. You have also a minus u term, but at a higher level, shifted up by this much. And then in between it has to sort of just connect these two terms. So this is a nonlinear dynamics in the sense it's not a straight line, but so far nothing has happened. There is still only a single fixed point that's a global attractor. So any state to the right, you have a negative rate of change converge here, and the vice versa on the other side. But if I now add inputs, so I vary these inputs, then interesting stuff could happen. So the gray shading here is supposed to be different input strings. So if I add more and more input, I'm shifting that curve up. And then you see there are the possibilities for other zero crossings here at different points. I'm getting some messages, wonder if these are probably for the lecture. And there are some repellers here I'll be talking about in a moment. So let's first jump into sort of the middle value where there are these multiple different intersections. So this would be an intermediate level of input. And at that intermediate level, you see there is that attractor at negative activation levels. I call this the off state. There's a different attractor here at positive activation levels. I call this an on state, in the sense that neuron transmits now something to its downstream neurons. And then there is another kind of fixed point with a positive slope, which would be called a repeller. Now, if you're a little bit to the right of that attractor, you will be moving away from it. A little bit to the left, negative rate of change, now moving away from it. So it divides the set of initial conditions. And you see this here in the flow. I'm plotted the future of points that start there for positive values. They all converge to the on state. The future of negative values, they all converge to the off state. Now, this is called a bistable dynamics. There are two attractors, two stable states, bistable, and they are divided by another invariant solution here. It's a repeller. So this is first of all, makes clear that stability is a property of a fixed point. It's not a property of the dynamic system. Some people say it's a stable dynamics, and then this refers to linear equations that have only one fixed point, but nonlinear equations have multiple fixed points. You always have to think of it's a property of a solution, a particular solution, a fixed point or solid, or other kinds of solutions as well that have stability properties, not just of the system. Sometimes loose talk to talk about the stable system. And so bistable is also a very good illustration that the future of a state will depend perhaps not only on input, as we'll see in a moment, it can also depend on whether you're on this top branch or on the bottom branch, which would reflect the history of your system, whether you previously got inputs that put you into one particular state here. Good, so let's examine here this region where an instability occurs. And so let's think we're sitting here in the off state and activation is added, input is added, so it's shifting this curve up, and we're somehow assuming that already, something happened on the right. So there is already this repeller here, and as we're lifting it up, this repeller will be moving left, will be colliding with this attractor, and they will be just touching here, and then if we lift it up further, there will be no more fixed point here on the left-hand side, so in the negative range. Here is a local picture of that. You see the repeller colliding with the attractor, just touching and then lifting off. This is called the tangent bifurcation. So what you have is there's an unstable fixed point here for positive u. This one collides with a stable fixed point, then they annihilate and leave no fixed point behind. So that would mean if you're sitting in this attractor, you track it as it changes. You keep, the dynamics pushes you along to keep close to the attractor. But when this here happens, let's say you're here, there's no more attractor left, and then you're going to be attracted to the other attractor. You're going to switch to this on state. This is why we call this the detection instability. It's an instability in the sense that there is a qualitative change here of the equation. It has two attractors before the instability, and then only one attractor after the instability. And the stability becomes weaker and then disappears. And you can read the stability off the slope here. The negative slope here is a question of how stable the state is. It tells you how quickly you recover to the attractor. And you see right at the instability, the slope becomes flat. It becomes actually horizontal right at the instability and becomes flatter and flatter as you approach that point. So it's a dynamical instability, a loss of stability that mediates this switch to the other attractor. That's why we call it detection instability, because if you think of this neuron as standing for something, for its input, it would now turn on and in response to that input that it stands for. And so it would say, I have detected whatever I stand for. So I'm now responding, yes, there is something of that nature, whatever it is, while before it was saying, no, there is nothing. That's why we call it detection instability. Now, at the other end of this, there is a similar bifurcation, it's just upside down. And so it would show up as a bifurcation if we go from high inputs to lower inputs. So if we decrease inputs, go down here, so stimulus strength return decreasing, then you would have an attractor on the right and a repeller on the left. So it's the same picture as before, just flipped. And essentially, this, again, the attractor is colliding with the repeller and nothing is left. And so if you're in this activated state and you are reducing the inputs, you would be ultimately, again, colliding with the repeller and then be left off and disappear. And so switch off. That's why we call it the reverse detection instability. You're losing the state that you initially stood for. Of course, if I'm look at this, let's say I'm starting here at this off state and I'm pushing up activation, this instability also happens, right? If I'm pushing it up, this suddenly there will be a new attractor forming and a new repeller forming. This was sort of glossed over when I looked at that first picture, but we wouldn't notice because we're sitting here in this attractor, right? We're tracking this attractor. So we don't notice that there's a new attractor available somewhere as long as we're not switching to that. So that instability is run through backwards in a way before we even get to detection, but we don't notice it. So we only notice it when we come from the on state, from the activated state. And this is, I'm going to run that simulation. This is sometimes observed as hysteresis. That is, if I increase activation, I will only switch on at the detection instability. If I decrease activation, I will only notice that when at the reverse detection instability, when I lose the activated state. So let's go back to our simulations here. So in this model, I can introduce self-excitation. It's this here, self-excitation, which makes this curve. Let's say make it really nice like this here. See, now you have that curve. I'm sitting actually in the off state. So again, actually, I'm not even noticing there's another attractor here. The parameter is set here to be, oh, I already started with non-zero input strength. So there you see this nonlinear dynamics. And now if I increase input strength, you see the new pair of repeller and attractor forms, but nothing special happens until the previous, sorry, I'm moving the wrong button. This is supposed to be 0 here. This, sorry, this button I was supposed not to touch. I'm lifting this up, and you see now that the attractor is moving toward the repeller, and move it up a little more, just right, and there it's running over. And now it stays in this new activated state, self-excited, right? There is more activation now than input. The input is actually, I have to say, input minus resting level. So it's just reflects, of course, the balance of these two. So if I go down it stays there, right? This is the bistable nature. So it stays in the on state, even though it was initially here, so it would have been initially stable in the off state. And only when this attractor is again destroyed does it switch off. Right? Very simple. Okay, so back to the slides. And I already showed you this hysteresis. We actually literally observed hysteresis in our perceptual work. Initially, that was my motivation to go to perception to see. Perception is often thought of as something activation forming in the brain as a function of input. And this would be a signature of that activation actually reflecting also previous perceptual states. And there is good evidence for perceptual hysteresis. It's you need to look at that carefully because not any dependence on the history is necessarily evidence for this. You have to, for instance, make sure it's not just that in the case of doubt, you're saying that you saw what you saw previously. It's called response bias and a couple of issues like that. So for us, the dynamic field theory, the detection instability is the key instability that makes a lot of the work that we need. And its most significant feature is actually that it is a way of how events arise. So in spiking neural networks, it's the spiking event, right? That's when they call it event-based computing. But we're not looking at this temporal fine structure in the biophysical implementation here. But this is a macroscopic event. This is when, for instance, you could think of whatever causes the input being some time continuous thing. For instance, a stimulus that's time varying, but in a continuous way. And then at some point it will reach a critical strength, and that will lead to the instability where you're covering a macroscopic distance. You're going from from a below threshold point to an above threshold pattern of activation. So the discrete event emerges, and then you're actually stable. So it's not just that you're sensitive to inputs, and so if the input falls back, then you're back. It's just transducing input. No, you actually make a decision, and then you stick with that decision for a while. There's a range over which you can undo the decision if you're sufficiently far from that. So in our later work, you will be seeing that we will see that a lot of the cognitive processing emerges from the detection instability and the reverse detection instability. Now, then, of course, then we'll have to think about more than just one neuron, and that's what we do next here. We're looking at two neurons, and with two neurons, you're looking at the first case where a system can make a choice, a selection decision between more than one thing, where there's competition. So if I think of two neurons, if they are excitatorily coupled, there is no difference to what I just talked about. It would be the same dynamical picture. Just couple of neurons exciting each other is like self-excitation. So I'm looking now instead at inhibitory coupling between these two neurons. So this one inhibits that one and vice versa, and shows up by having these negative terms here. Again, we're just thinking of these neurons as really being standing in for small populations. I'll make that exact in a moment. So the neuron number 2 showing up in the equation for neuron number 1, and vice versa, neuron number 1, equation of neuron number 2. That is what coupling means. We sometimes also call it interaction. These are terms from physics and sort of make a physical, intuitive sense. These are, again, forms of recurrency, right? This would be, in a sense, a loop where there would be this neuron being influenced through this route and then influencing through that route, right? That is a particular loop that has changing signs here. So we call this coupling interaction. Now this creates, again, bistability, and I will be providing you with some way of looking at that. So let's do some mental gymnastics for that, make that very simple. So first, let's assume that neuron number 2 is already positive. So is here in some positive activation state. If that's the case, the sigmoid of U2 is not, is positive, so it will have a negative effect on neuron number 1. So we'll lower the rate of change of neuron number 1, and we're assuming here it's strong enough that inhibition to make that the attractor here is in the negative half space. So there's an attractor for neuron number 1 and a negative range activation level. And that is a consistent solution, because when that is the case, then neuron number 1 does not inhibit neuron number 2. And so this term is 0. And so our initial assumption that we could have a neuron number 2 that's in the activated state is consistent with that. So that's one possible solution. Now you see that that's a solution where the only one is positive and the other is negative, right? And in that sense, it's a selective or a competitive state, right? These two neurons are in a sense competing. So when one is on, the other is off, and vice versa. And nothing in the argument I just used has anything to do with the number of the neuron or the index of the neuron. So you can see that I'll come to your question in a moment. And then you see there's nothing in this that makes U2 special. So the other solution is just as stable as the first solution. So this will be a bistable case. You can either activate U1 or you can activate U2. Now, one of you actually asked what if the inputs are different for the two neurons? And yes, that is exactly where the limit of that picture is. And I'll maybe illustrate that in the simulation. So in the simulation here, I reduce the self-excitation, and now I'm using these two neurons. And what I can do is I make these two neurons, let me correct that first here, make a connection strength that's negative. So I'm having a negative coupling from neuron number 1 to number 2, and also vice versa. And actually in the simulator, I can not make the same input strength for the two neurons at the same time, because I have to move these sliders, move one of those sliders first. I can't move both sides at the same time, and then we will see what happens. So if I first make this neuron active, as soon as its input is strong enough to push its activation above 0, so it's a positive level of activation, you see that the inhibitor influence on the other neuron. So now this neuron is suppressed below its resting level to -10 based on the inhibitor influence from that first neuron. And so it's deeply inactive. So if I now give this neuron the same input strength, I made it symmetrical, everything is 5, same input strength here, it stays below threshold because of that inhibition from that neuron. No chance. You see, it's firmly below threshold. But if I remove input from the first neuron, it decays, and at some point it releases this neuron from inhibition. Now it's actually just at threshold. Make it maybe a little bit larger. Now it's above threshold, and it begins to inhibit that first neuron. And so now, if I give that second neuron maybe even the same level of input, 6.8, or can even give it more, like 8.8, the first neuron is still wins the competition. It is still active because the other neuron is inhibited by the first neuron. So it's bistable, and in fact we're learning more from the simulation than just from this picture, the qualitative discussion, because we're seeing that who wins the competition is based on temporal structure in input. Of course, if the neuron was already active because of some prior stimulus, then it would be the initial condition that would determine which neuron wins, in which dynamic regime you are. But very typically, of course, the neurons will always be in or near an attractor, and if there was no input, they would be near the off attractor. So what will decide the competition is who gets input first. And let me switch to the slides and to make that point. And actually, I'll explain that in more detail in the dynamic field case next. But I can give you the rough idea. So the idea would be that if one of those neurons gets more input than the other, it would actually drive it faster because you're high up in the exponential. So initially you're going very fast. So you will be reaching threshold earlier than the other neuron, and that would make it more likely that you are winning the competition. Because you cross threshold first, you can inhibit the other neuron first, and only then the first neuron would get a chance to inhibit the other one, but because it's suppressed, it never reaches that level. And that's how the asymmetrical input will bias competition toward the one with larger input winning the competition. Even if so there are even instabilities. So when you're sitting in one attractor, that is, you selected one of these two states and you're increasing the input on the other choice much more than on the first choice, you can actually undo the decision. And I'll show you that in the fields picture. It's a little bit awkward to do that in this very simple discrete simulator. So that's hopefully the answer to your question. Good. So the last point we need to make is in this first, to lay the foundations of dynamic fields is to lift that to the dynamics of fields. And it turns out that the dynamics of fields are really only these two things. We only need to understand excitatory interaction that creates the detection instability, and we need to understand inhibitory interaction that creates selective properties, and that together actually does everything we will ever need in neurodynamic field theory. Roughly speaking, there are some subtleties that we'll get into later, but these are the core ideas. So here's a sort of a survey over an activation field, and we're postulating that local neighbors excite each other, and larger distances, there's inhibitory interaction, and that will actually make that they are both selective and capable of detection decisions, and it will be localized peaks of activation that will be the attractor states. So mathematically, this is the general form of writing this. So it looks a bit complicated with the integral and so on, but it's actually the same as the systems we looked at so far. So here's the minus u term, the negative resting level, any input. It can be different inputs at different locations in the field. So I'm plotting now a whole field. It's conventional to not use the field dimension as an index, but to write it as part of the function. It's just a mathematical convention. So we're talking about an activation field that depends on this dimension x and on time. And then this term really contains the two types of coupling we just looked at. So the integral is just a continuous form of the sum. So we're summing over all other field locations x other than this x we're looking at, and activation at any other location x prime that passes through the sigmoid will influence u dot at location x, and its influence will depend on the distance between x and x prime according to a kernel, so-called interaction kernel. So when that distance is small, x minus x prime is small, then we're close here to the origin, and that's where this will be positive. It's this excitatory part of the kernel. Here it's modeled as a Gaussian, so it falls off. And this is the other use of sigma here, that the width of this Gaussian we also call sigma, not the same as that sigma. So that's the region over which it's excitatory. Then if the distance is large enough, it will have this negative component, which we here assumed is no longer dependent on distance, just constant, minus this negative. And then this will be a negative contribution during the inhibitory. So if you compare to what we just did, you could think of these two neurons being samples of the field. So one location was one population, another location was the other location, and self-excitation would be just summing, the effective description of this local region. An input that this neuron would be sensitive to is what we call S1. An input that neuron is sensitive to is what we call S2. And the inhibition between those two neurons would be a question of the distance of the two locations, and would be possibly could be scaled with that distance. So you see, there's a much more specific picture than the field picture, and all of this would be fixed. So that's the notion of a field dynamics, and we can immediately look at that in simulation. I go to the other simulator for that purpose. Oops. one layer field simulator, which also is available on the webpage right away. Thanks to Algrim who did this. You can actually load different kernels here. I load the, I don't know, I think it's this one that I like best. This particular kernel, actually, it's not exactly the same. Let's maybe do this one. Yeah, this is the one that I just showed you here. In the bottom, you just see a static picture of the kernel. You can play with kernel parameters. Like if you play with stuff here, then you can see the result of that. So this is at the bottom. This is plotted around distance in feature space being 0. This will be the excitatory portion, and then you see here this is all negative. This will be the inhibitory portion. So, and this kernel is applied to any location along the field. Now on top you see a blue line. It's a bit fluctuating because I added, or there's a noise added here. We can vary the noise with the slider, and that would be the the blue noise reflects that. And below that you saw the green line. The green line is the inputs plus the resting level. So when I vary the resting level, you can see that then this varies, but I will also be able to vary this by inputs. It's by default -5. And I have here a battery of sliders with which I can add inputs. These are Gaussian inputs, little Gaussians, you see that here. And there are 3, and you can vary the position of these inputs and the width of these inputs. You can also change the time scale of the dynamics and parameters of the kernel and the resting level. Now, so the first thing that you saw is that this is also a low-pass filter. That is, if I vary the input, the blue line, tracks the green line, and the delay is essentially reflective of the time scale and, of course, the numerical procedure. I mean, it's shown in real time based on my computer taking some time to do this integration. So let's look at the single location here, and I'm adding input very slowly. So the blue tracks the green, and you see the red line is actually the sigmoid applied to the field. We call it output here. And you see when I push the input to push that sufficiently to push the field above 0, something happens. This is actually the detection instability. So what happens is that I get a positive contribution. The red curve is now the sigmoid, returns a non-zero value. The red curve is actually plotted on a different scale. It's supposed to be 1, and it's plotted by 10 times larger scale, so you can see it. And what you see here is that there is more activation than input here. Again, the green is input plus resting level, so net input, if you wish, or the resting level being negative. And that's really caused by self-excitation, right? So you can see it's pulling itself up by its own hair, if you wish, so that you get this peak of activation. And then everywhere else, the activation is actually lowered below the resting level by inhibition from that peak. Now, this is an actual instability in the system is bistable. I can demonstrate it to you by reducing the input level. So for instance, here I have an input level that is below 0. And at that input level, I previously had no peak, just a subthreshold peak. But now I have this activated peak. And so I'm in this bistable regime. I can demonstrate to you by resetting. It restarts at the resting level. And see, it actually stays in this low threshold solution. So you can see the bistability, right? So what happens is really that this state, this sub-threshold state, becomes unstable. As I increase this input, move it closer to 0, it becomes unstable. This is just at the input. And because of my noise, I went through that. I'll reduce noise to make it very clear. When I reduce noise to 0, then it's really right here that the instability arises, right? Very clean. Now, typically with noise, you are able to switch just a little bit before. Noise really has only an effect on the dynamics very close to instabilities. If I'm in a good stable state, I can make a lot of noise and I will not really change the dynamics qualitatively. Good, so that's the detection instability. And then the reverse detection instability happens somewhere here where the activation disappears. I'm very close. And actually by noise, this switched off. And so around here, the system again becomes monostable, only the subthreshold solution is stable. So this is this bistable regime where the peak can exist. The exact range of that state and so on depends on the kernel parameters, and there are some other kernels that you can play with that vary these, the width of this regime. Good. The other thing I want to demonstrate is selection. So I'm bringing in some activation here at some other location, have a nice peak here. And I have a kernel that is globally inhibitory. So all these locations compete with each other. So if I introduce that same level of activation, it's actually exact same number here, and that other location, see suprathreshold, it's far from inducing a peak here, right? It's really prevented from generating a peak because this one won and suppresses this one. This would be the regime in the field in the selection regime. And again, this peak is around because it was around earlier, and therefore it starts to suppress this one, and then this one cannot conversely suppress that one. So, for instance, if I reduce this first, second has a chance to win. And if I now reintroduce the second, then even, it can be even stronger values, then the system sticks with that initial decision. It's again a bistable state, and therefore there's a hysteresis effect that is what, if you're committed to one choice, you will need much larger evidence for the other choice. And I can ultimately destabilize that if I make this input large enough, the system switches. If I now return the inputs to similar values, it will stick to that choice. So again, if you think of this as a neural network, in a neural network, the input strength will reflect how well a particular input pattern matches the current, the connectivity to the field. So for instance, if you have, let's say, color, and you have a red input, and you're looking at a region, let's say a peak that's around the orange, maybe close to the red, and then that will be very effectively driven by the red input. You will get a selection, and other locations, maybe blue or so, will not. And so, larger input strength translates into earlier reaching of threshold, because if you have a larger input strength, your exponential relaxation is on a steeper part of its curve and reaches, more quickly reaches a particular threshold, and will thus, give a temporal advantage to the activation. I want to show two more things here. One is what's called sustained activation. So here, when I reduce input, the peak decays, right? And that's due to the reverse detection instability. Now, you can make conditions under which this reverse detection instability only occurs at negative inputs. The cheap way to do that is to just push the resting level high, but you can also really do this by just changing the kernel parameters. And there will be a different dynamic regime, as we call that. And so, for instance, here, maybe if I'm lucky, I'm already in the sustained regime. Yeah. And so this is a regime where if I remove the localized input, the peak remains. Sustained activation, we call that. That's the standard model of working memory, of activation being around without the inducing input. So this peak stays around just by the mutual excitatory interaction within the population of neurons. It's like a volley of activation that keeps itself going to thus form a long-term trace of the history, because at some point there was some input, and I can sustain this activity that reflects where that input previously was on a timescale that's much larger than the timescale of the dynamics. That's why it's it's a memory kind of thing, or working memory, that much longer than input. And we'll later argue that most higher cognitive action occurs in this regime, that you're actually basing your mental operations on activation that was induced at some earlier point, but that is now kept in the neural network and the architecture by ultimately this form of interaction. It's not the absolute thing. You could have inferences, maybe you have some global inhibition, and that reduces this level, and then the peak can decay. Good. That's sustained activation. There's actually a nicer regime here, memory, which allows you to put multiple peaks in the system, but I don't want to go into that. And you'll have an opportunity to play with that. Now, the last thing I want to demonstrate is something rather subtle. It's also quite far-reaching. We'll see the signature of that across many lectures. So what I'm doing here is I'm introducing very small inputs that you barely see. I don't think you can see that. I'm actually not sure. Maybe they're too small for this to work. You see, does that work? Yeah, it does. So I had very, very, very little inputs. So there are three regions here. Let me, I'm not sure that with this notion, maybe make it a little bit stronger. Maybe this is safer. I don't know. 0.4. 0.4. Okay, so let's delete that and restart that. So I have this very small inhomogeneity, so a little bit more activation here, here, and there, these three positions, 25, 15, 75, where there is this little input. And all I'm doing is giving a boost to the system to bring this close to threshold. And you see a peak forms, and this is a fully formed peak. It has pretty much the same shape as the previous peaks we had, based on very little localized input. If I reset that, the peak will form is actually under these conditions, everything being perfectly homogeneous. It could be random where it will arise. Hopefully, if I did this right, it would show up. Got a lot of probability for this left one. Damn it. Yeah, now I got it in the middle. And maybe I'm lucky in any way, I should get the rightmost also. You see there's a little bit of an homogeneity there at some point. No, strong left foot bias, yeah. Oh, it's matching that this number, yeah. Strong left foot bias here. I don't know. I have some parameter not exactly symmetrical. But so the important point is that this system, it's a detection instability, right? It's going through the detection instability by the boost. The resetting is really just a way of taking away the boost and then reintroducing the boost at some point. And what this then, there I got the one on the right. And this shows several things. First of all, these peaks can be thought of as sort of amplifying small differences in the initial condition or in the initial state. So if you think of learning or prior influences, and you'll see next lecture, you'll see a lot of subtle ways how we can combine multiple inputs to create inhomogeneous landscapes, then the detection instability amplifies them into full peaks. So if you think of the peaks as units of representation, the things that carry meaning, that impact downstream aspects in architectures, these peaks can be brought about mostly by interaction. This is what happens here. Just keep it lifted to the point of firing, then these neurons excite each other and a peak forms. And therefore, they amplify any small differences. They will form in one of those locations where there's a little bit more current activation, which could be through what we'll later see as a memory trace, or could be through some inputs that's a little bit stronger somewhere than somewhere else. So amplifying small differences. And that makes a real difference with respect to learning. That is, you will need much less change in synaptic input patterns to learn than if you have a conventional neural network where you really need to make a macroscopic difference, where one location is really larger than other locations. If you just look at, let's say, the one to wake a winner takes all just based on the activation level, it would be very, very minimal here. And the other point to see out of that is that categories are for free. Categories are easy to get. So it's actually the homogeneous state, the continuum, that's hard to get. You have to make sure that all the inputs have same strength so that the peak could arise just at any location. So, and we'll see that we'll get categorical behavior out of neural fields. The interesting thing is to get non-categorical behavior out of neural fields. And that's really what is the constituent feature of dynamical fields, and the fact that they can represent things they've never represented before, let's say. It's much easier, as in the Hopfield picture, to just get different categories. Yeah, these are the two main points that I want to make in the context of that simulation. So coming back to my slides, summarize here the kind of things I just demonstrated to you. So I demonstrated to you that there are subthreshold, we sometimes call them input-driven solutions, that in the detection instability go into these self-stabilized solutions, the peaks, or suprathreshold solutions, sometimes called bump attractors, and the different names given to that. And the reversed transition occurs in the detection instability, the reverse detection instability, where these peaks disappear, or a peak disappears and transitions to one of those subthreshold solutions. And that's really how you bring in peaks, or peaks go out of the system. The peaks are the language in which we'll be talking. And then when we're talking about more than one possible location, it's selection, and the selection regime is limited by instability. So if the inputs are too different, then there will be a unique selection. So the system is monostable. If there are multiple possible locations and they're similarly activated, then you could stabilize an earlier selection in the face of competing input that's overwhelming. That will be important for things like attention selection, suppressing distractors, cognitive control, and things like that. Then I showed you that working memory is essentially when the reverse detection instability isn't reachable, and the working memory itself can become unstable simply when the reverse detection instability becomes reachable again, for instance, by a question of changes in connectivity in the kernel, but also maybe things like inputs, global inputs. So you can make a system able to sustain by just giving global input to a system, boosting the system. And the last thing I showed you is how the boost-driven detection instability leads to categorical responding and to the spontaneous emergence of events, or amplifying small differences to then reinstantiate peaks. And I'll show you later how that, combined with the memory trace, actually leads to the reactivation of previous activation patterns, previously seen activation patterns. So dynamic field theory is really characterized by the stable states, the attractor states. We're postulating that the attractor states organize the time course of activation patterns, and the flexibility of these systems comes from the instability. So the instabilities are an important component of dynamic field theory. That is actually the technical difference between the way we look in dynamical field theory at neural networks and most other neural networks. So we're not categorically different. These are special cases, if you wish, of recurrent neural networks. It's this emphasis on instabilities that gives us a special flavor. I also point out that, again, or remind you that noise is important near instabilities. That's where it makes a difference. It doesn't make a difference somewhere else, but near instabilities, it essentially keeps the system from getting stuck in some barely stable state. The noise is like a probe of that. So in our modeling work, we often talk about dynamic regimes, and it's a little bit abstract term, and refers to which particular attractors are observed and what kind of instabilities arise as input vary. So we're not just talking about particular attractors, because it's always the attractors and their dependence on input. So for instance, in a perceptual regime, we might have the transition from a monostable subthreshold case, or no percept, to a suprathreshold peak that could be bistable with a subthreshold system. So that will be a transition to the possibility of having a percept or not, and have a third regime where there's S missing, where you have only the monostable peak. So this could be a perceptual regime. A working memory regime is where there would be no return to the subthreshold solutions, where you're only staying in the bistable regime, essentially. And you could have selective, so only a single peak can exist, or multiple peaks can exist, and other things. The width of the signal, someone is asking what the width of the signal in the simulations means. That's a good question. So so there are two different widths: input widths, and there are kernel widths. Kernel widths determine strongly the dynamics. So if you vary the kernel width, then everything changes, and you will have to make sure that you have the right dynamic regime, because there's a lot of energy in these kernels, right? In the simulations, you see that perhaps that if I maybe reset this here, if I induce a peak, see a lot of the activity here in the field is really comes from, oh, what funny interaction do I have here? Yeah, comes from the kernel. So all of this inhibition here comes from the kernel. The input width can be varied, of course. I could have inputs of different widths, and you see that they are not really reshaping the kernel very much, the peak very much. You could say that if you have a very strong, very narrow input, then you have a problem potentially. And the problem could be that the peak will not be so stable on top of that, because it is not very sensitive to, the peak is amplified by the kernel, and on the side, that what stabilizes the peak, for instance, what enables the peak to track. Oops, actually, you have an illustration right there to track that wouldn't track so well anymore. It's still reasonable here. And when the input is very broad, you have a similar problem. When you're very broad, it's also not so well able to track the field. You see the gradient is not very small. So in a way, there is some sense in which the kernel determines what with inputs this field is most sensitive to, and tracks nicely. Tracks really means goes to the attractor on a reasonable time scale. And that also determines the scale over which you make selection decisions. So when are two inputs bimodal, that also invites to make a selection between those, and it will be the kernel of the width of the interaction kernel that determines where that happens. And let's say if I make a very narrow input width, and then I put, let's say, two inputs here and put them close to each other. Oh, I want to make this one also very narrow here. And now that determines over, what kind of resolution the field has. And there you see if it's not matched to the kernel, then that will not necessarily work right. For instance, if I have a broad enough kernel, it would do something like averaging. I don't have the time to really figure that out in detail, but you will get averaging possibly, so that it can fill in, like make a, I don't have the width button right here. Actually, on this simulator, I can't vary the width of the kernel, but there is a Cosivina simulator that allows you to do that. So the upshot is that per default, there is like a preferred input width that is sensitive or is determined by the kernel width. You think of the kernels as something more rigid in the nervous system, sort of fixed, not easy to change. And that sort of determines the operational mode and determines what are units of representation, what are states that make sense in the cognitive architecture. And then the input widths are sort of adapted to that. So the forward kernels that determine the input width will reflect these kind of properties. And if there's a mismatch, then the field doesn't necessarily operate within the right, in a meaningful way. So in the brain, we would postulate that the input widths are just right to enable the function of the field, the decision function on what it selects in the field. So it's not arbitrary. So this will be a topic that will be coming to. So, The width of the input kernels, of course, also determine the resolution. When do you start to see two things as bimodal versus monomodal? And so that's supposed to be right, so that you start to see those things as bimodal that are really functionally different, that make functional sense to be discriminated. Okay. Good. Hope that was a sufficient answer. Okay, so I have two more items. It's 5 o'clock, and I think I'm supposed to finish by 5:30. I have two more things to say. The first is to give you some kind of example of how the fields can be used now to model. And the last is, what is the last? I don't remember. We'll see. I don't recall right now what the last point is I'm going to make. So let's go through this case study. So this is a classic example that we used initially, how to explain initiation decisions or reaction time when you decide to execute an action in response to a stimulus. And that was establishes sort of a link between classic ideas of computing, information processing, versus doing this with fields, space-time, continuity. And actually, I think I also talked briefly about neural implementations. Yes, I talk about population code. Oh, and embodiment. Yeah, now I remember what the last one will be, embodiment. So let's just jump right into that. And so classical reaction time is sort of a reaction time paradigm. Is a decision task, right? You're making a choice decision. I'm talking about choice reaction times, and that choice decision will, very simple caricature will mean that there are more than one possible choice. For instance, you maybe have two different buttons or different objects to grasp here. Took that example. And you have to select which one. You will know what your choices are, sometimes called the task set. And then you get a stimulus that it's called the imperative signal. That is, it tells you exactly what to do. In this case, let's say you're supposed to take the glass. And in many paradigms, it's also the go signal. That is, once you get that stimulus, you are invited to now react. And then you're making your response. And the reaction time is actually the time from the initiation, from the go signal, imperative signal, to the initiation of your response. The response time would also include the time it takes to make the response, which is sometimes taken into account, sometimes not. This is sort of a more motor thing of how long it actually takes to do that. But the first indication of you initiating the response would be taken to measure the reaction time, which would be a measure of when you are ready to make the decision. And so classically, people have been thinking of that as something that reflects how hard it is to make the choice. And how hard means how much information do you need to process. So for instance, when you have very subtle discrimination tasks to do, then you would assume that you have to compute to a higher precision the representation of that information, and therefore that would take longer and your reaction time would be longer. Sort of a classical idea. Now, it's important maybe to recognize that these are decision tasks, but the answer is uniquely given. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. There's a right choice and a wrong choice. It's not a free decision where you take whatever you like better. Free decisions are sometimes studied. They're very interesting to us. They're studied in infants because you can't really give them a well-defined task. And that's very interesting. That's why we actually did our A0B work on infants. And they are studied in saccadic eye movements because those are so fast that you can't really consciously influence them very much. And they are, in some special animal experiments where you do that. In almost all other cases, you have a forced choice, an imperative signal where what the right decision is uniquely determined by the experimenter. So you don't have free choice. But you can make these very time-pressed, and then you're getting closer to something that is less uniquely specified by the go signal. And I'll show you that. Now, in our kind of thinking, what would be the the task set. The task set is often not really emphasized much in the theoretical discussion of choices. So we would say the task set is something known a priori. It's like you know what the possibilities are. And so we would say when you look at the evolution of a field that describes the inner state of selection, you already have some information about what's coming up. We call this the field is pre-shaped. It could be by perceptual layout. You see, like here in the example, there are these two objects on the table. And so you would say these two objects maybe, pre-activate some part of your representation. Here, the representation is supposed to be different movements. So some movement parameter. And then the specific input is provided. Specific input would be both a strong input that will create a peak, that would the go signal aspect of it, but also specify one of those choices. So it's localized here, for instance, on the leftmost choice. And that would be the imperative signal that tells you this is the right choice. And so all the reaction time effects in literature would be reflected by the interplay between these, this initial shape, the task set, and the final, the right shape, where the peak is supposed to be at the end. And see, in field theory, these things are all integrated into the time course of the generation of a peak of activation over the right choice. And using that picture, we were able to account in our original work, this is now more than 20 years, it's actually exactly 20 years now, this has appeared, we're able to account for the typical kinds of effects in this literature. So for instance, Higgs' law that the reaction time increases with the number of choices. If you look into more detail, it has this feature that it depends on the logarithm of the number of choices in an almost linear way. There's a little bit of a saturation effect. So if the number of choices is very large, then you saturate ultimately. And this is actually from the model, but empirical data are like that. And we were able to both get the logarithmic nature of this right, to get different levels of this in terms of stimulus response compatibility, and to get that saturation effect right. And in the model, it's essentially a subtle influence. If you think of the different choices, different pre-activations, these are all sub-threshold levels of activation. This would be a choice, 4 choice, 2 choice. And see, these would be all little pre-activations that, the blue curve here, the light blue, that reflect the different choices. And the notion would be that if you are selecting, it's always the leftmost, they're all aligned by the leftmost here. That if you look at the evolution of the peak, when you specify leftmost, give that a strong input, then these would be sources of inhibition. Subtle because it's sub-threshold, but enough to cause a difference. So for instance, here the A-choice task, the peak of activation in the field arises later than in the 2-choice task because of the inhibitory influences of these choices, and actually turns us mathematically to have the right shape. So that's possible to account for these effects, and we were able to essentially take a whole large set of classical effects like Hyman's law and stimulus response compatibility laws and Simon effect and Stroop effect and so on, and make spin a story in terms of these. It's essentially the difference in activation between this pre-shaped activation pattern and the final pattern that predicts the reaction time. Of course, that's also a little bit boring because you would say, well, that's just sort of retranslating everything into these metric differences in the fields. And so more interesting maybe to look at effects that are unique to this kind of theory. And we stumbled across an effect we call metric effect. And this has a real interesting personal history in that this was work I did with Wolfram Ennehagen during his doctoral thesis in Bochum. And then I moved to Marseille to the lab headed at the time by Jean Requin. And I told him about this work. This was not yet published at the time. And he told me that he had observed effects like this, published in an exotic French journal, Le Travail Humain, which is not really a mainstream, like a very prominent journal. And he had published it in this not so fancy journal because it wasn't so interesting to mainstream researchers at the time. It was kind of difficult to get it accepted because people thought, well, it's kind of an odd question. reflecting, the mindset at the time of that field, and later turned out to be really linked to population code and neural activation patterns, and really actually quite insightful. We first explain what the effect is, and you'll see then why it's a little bit odd. So this is an effect that would be predicted even for a two-choice task. So you have two choices, like two movements, and they could either be far from each other, like 90 degrees, or they could be close to each other, like 30 degrees. And we're predicting here that when they are close to each other, the reaction time is going to be faster than when they're far from each other. It's a bit counterintuitive, because you would say, classically, you would say, well, these movements are more similar, so I have to compute more to get to discriminate between them, and therefore it should be slower when they are close to each other. And that is actually what you observe when you make it a perceptual classification task. Like if you have to say if two things are the same or different, then it will take longer to make the decision when the difference between them is very small. But if it's this kind of movement task, it's the opposite effect. We call this the metric effect, and the other one the distance effect. It's also a challenge to understand the distance effect, and I don't think I have these slides here, but we can make sense of that too. This effect turns out to be true, and Jean Lequin had these kind of effects published in his Le Travail Humain effect, where we very systematically varied the metrics of choices and a couple of things. We reproduced that data with the student of John Jacob, and some of this is published, and it was actually done then while I was in Marseille. So for instance, here's an example of a 2 or 3 choice task, a center button, and you move out, and all kind of complications to make sure that there isn't no difference in attention, and all kinds of subtleties. And the main question is really, does the reaction time depend on the angle between these choices? And so here you look at the angle between these choices, and then the 2 versus 3 choice has a different story. And you see, roughly speaking, there is one special case here. But with respect to the others, you see that as you increase the angular separation, the reaction time increases. So it's faster for more similar choices. There's another variant of this that's better from an experimental point of view, that mixes the Hyman law with the metric effect. So the Hyman law is that you're making if there's a difference in probability of one choice, then the low probability choice takes longer to activate than the high probability choice, right? So for instance, if this one occurs more often than that one, then you will be, activation will rise faster in this more probable choice than the less probable choice. That would be called the Hyman effect, and we also model that. We model that by assuming that probable choice have a higher pre-activation than less probable choices. And so see these assumptions about how the experimental conditions map onto inputs or pre-shape, and how then certain aspects of the evolution of activation, like the threshold piercing, map onto measures. That's how you can sort of interface dynamic field models with sort of experimental conditions, and this sort of the psychology style of doing that. Later, we'll be looking at cases where we're really driving the field by by camera input, and really maybe making an arm move. That will be a much more embodied way of doing that. So this will be the Hyman effect. Now, the more subtle issue here is that the Hyman effect is actually that if you increase the difference in probability, like here's a small difference in probability, here's a high difference in probability, here's a small difference in reaction time, a high difference in reaction time. That is actually Hyman's law. And now the interaction is that here we're seeing the same difference in probability as here, but the choices just moved close to each other. We're predicting that destroys the Hyman effect. So now, even though this difference in probability is just as here, now there will be less of a difference in reaction time. And in fact, both choices are going to be faster. That's the prediction. And that's a good prediction experimentally. It's an interaction which doesn't depend on some sort of baseline issues. Interaction in the statistical sense, for those of you who know that. You have two parameters, and you predict the probability and the metrics, and you're predicting that reaction time. There's an interaction between the metrics and the probability. And here is a result from a published experiment where we had a center out task with one of the movements being rare, the other being frequent. I think it was maybe 1 to 10. Something like that. It was 10% of the rare over 90% of the frequent. And this would be the metrically wide condition. That would be the metrically narrow condition. And you see the movement that you're looking at is the same movement. Just a question of what the alternative was. And you're observing the gray line is some control condition. Pay attention to colored lines. You see that you're having here the Hyman effect for the white choice. That is, the rare target takes longer than the frequent target. And when you make them metrically close, then it's gone. The rare and the frequent target have the same reaction time, and it's close to the faster reaction time, just as predicted. We also did some EEG stuff here, ERPs that has some meaning for that. Even more dynamic in a way, you could actually say we can observe the time course of activation in the brain. As you know, if you go back to this picture, we can observe directly this sort of neural thing, hypothesized neural activation pattern, by looking directly into behavior. And this is makes use of the so-called time movement initiation paradigm that was used by Claude Gayes and colleagues for different purposes. But now actually we interpreted these data in this sense. And this is a way to control when people make the decision. You can train people to move on a metronome, like the fourth tone on a metronome, like these tones go up, beep, 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 the fourth tone is higher, and they can learn to make the movement very close to that fourth tone, even though you give them information about which movement to make only at some controlled and maybe very short stimulus response interval. So here's a concrete example. They have an isometric force task where they have to pass a cursor, against the joystick to move the cursor up or down, and different levels of force they need to do. And they will learn which force level, like here, this one, only a short time before this fourth tone on which they initiate the choice. They will still take some time to reach there, but when you vary the stimulus response interval, they will reliably track that in post response time. And so now you can see if what they will do for short response times when they have little time to compute versus, what they will do when they have a long response time. And here's some raw data to illustrate that. So this is the movement, the direction of that force, and there are the three levels of force: the 50, the 30, and the 10. And this is the condition when the 50 up was right. I mean, it's actually the two conditions are mirrored and mapped onto each other. So these are the correct responses. You see that there is the very fast responses. This is the very short stimulus response interval. They are sort of in the middle, like around 30. Also, sometimes go in the wrong direction. And then over time, they're continuously changing and then converging on the correct choice at 50. And the incorrect directions don't occur for enough response time. And they actually also go drift. It's also interesting. And the middle choice, they are sort of right from the start. They just get more focused, and the categorical errors are fewer. And then for the small choice, they start with this default value in the middle, and then they are converging to the correct choice. And again, the categorical error going in the wrong direction, they die out with response time. That's observing in a way the probabilistically across trials the distribution of activation, if you wish, if you interpret the activation as driving these initial choices. So we generated that from the model. This is a way of plotting this experimental stuff I just showed you at different intervals, and I took just the center and the smallest choice, and we reproduced that with a model very well. And so one significant thing is that when you see that drift from the default answer to the correct answer, that there are intermediate stages where the most frequent choices are ones that were never specified, and you have that also in the model, right? You see that. And there are other subtleties that can model like that. Here's this was isometric forces. One can actually also do that in actual reaching movements done by students of Claude Gayes. And it's interesting in that when you vary the angular opening, you can see at which point does the initial distribution switch from monomodal, from averaging to sort of selection. And that happens at around 60 to 90 degrees separation, which would be predicted if you think of cosine tuning from a certain representation, neural representation. And that's what is actually empirically observed. So you can actually also observe this neurally. This is work I did in Marseille with my colleague Alex Arillo, who recorded from monkeys' motor and premotor cortex. There are neurons there that are tuned to move in direction. The monkeys were making a center Austar, so a center button. They got a signal, they put their finger on the center button, and then in our experiment, they were given some prior information if it's going to be these two targets, that target, or these three, and then one of those targets lights up, and then the monkey, that's the go signal, and the imperative signal, the monkey is then allowed to lift the hand off the center button and reach the target button, and we look at the reaction time also when it lifts off the center button. But you can actually record from neurons that are movement related, so that vary their firing with the imminence of the movement. So these are time courses of firing. Every dot here is a spike. The trials are ordered by reaction time, and you see the rasterogram for the different movements, 6 different movements. In each case, this will be the rasterogram for these movements. So this is just one cell. And so you see that they are movement related in the sense they modulate their firing to fire primarily around the time before and a little around the time of movement initiation. So they are really about specifying the movement. And they actually stop firing once the hand has moved. So this is the lifting off of the hand, and then this is landing on the target button. They're also tuned to move in direction. You see these neurons, this neuron fires much more for this direction and neighboring directions than for the opposite direction. So it's a so-called cosine tuning. And you can take a lot of these neurons, for instance, like 100 across different experiments, even from a single animal. These are behaving animals that do this every day. And you can take a lot of these kind of data, take these tuning curves that I just showed you, the green curves, and construct from them what we call a distribution of population activation. So what you do is you multiply the tuning curve with the current firing rate to get sort of a representation of what, under the current conditions, that neuron contributes. And if you do that, for instance, in the original task where the movement is uniquely given, then the tuning curves that are large around the required direction will be multiplied with a larger number. So it will be this curve, and those that are far will be multiplied with a small number. If you add those up, you will get this red curve that will be the population representation, distribution of population activation over the parameter movement direction, right? It's not the distribution on the brain, it's in the parameter space. The peak of that distribution is what Categorical called the population vector, for those of you who know that sort of stuff. And so with that kind of construction, you can actually track the time course of the neural decision making. And that's based on using the current firing rate in different time intervals. And so, for instance, here you can see the time course of decision making in slices, I think, of 50 milliseconds, or was it 25? I don't remember. And you see that there is some initial activation here around the cued direction. And then toward the response, you can see the growth of the peak, and then the movement is initiated somewhere there. So you can really see the time course of decision making. I'll show you one other picture in a moment. First, let me draw your attention to an interesting fact. In the distribution of population activation, the neurons are not really localized, right? Because we take the whole tuning curve, so they're smeared out over the field. So we think of the distribution of population activation being actually the neural equivalent of the fields, where the peaks make sense. And so it's a much more abstract kind of picture than the picture that taking cortex and smearing things out in cortex. There's some way of having a discourse with projection about that, but I want to gloss over that. So in the work with Alexa, we looked at things like when we vary the amount of prior information, once we get a broad peak that's barely visible here, when there is a broad pre-Q and a sharper peak, when there's a sharp pre-Q, and we were able to show that the peak predicts reaction time and things like that. Paul Zizek and John Kalaska made actually the better move of making these choices categorically separate. This was a couple of years after we did this work. And you see that In this case, you have a bimodal distribution. You get activation. This is dorsal premotor cortex. You get activation. This is actually also the same distributional population activation. It's called cells here, but every cell is again represented by its tuning curve. And you see here that the neurons that are tuned to this one will be firing, and the neurons tuned to that direction are firing. And then after some period, this is actually the period where the monkey has to keep in mind the targets, and only then is informed about which target to go to in terms of color code. So it has to go to the red target here, for instance. And then you will see the selection decision that this becomes up and this here is inhibited, exactly like in the field. And they actually used dynamic field theory to model this here. And then actually at the go signal, there is a boost, and this peak goes to the threshold, and the monkey is actually moving to the correct target. And so you see this. So what you see neurally here, we even earlier in some sense saw behaviorally. Good. And so I have 10 minutes left according to our plan, and I will use these last 10 minutes to establish, to make a little bit more concrete how these fields, I was talking about these fields that represent movement direction, and early on the choice dimension, and then some input is like a sigmoid, Gaussian, and someone asked, Anidita, I think, asked this question about input width, and then we read out something. So how does it actually really connect to sensory inputs and to motor inputs more realistically? And so in this second example, I'm looking at a robotic example where we're linking a field really up to sensory and motor inputs, and sensory inputs and motor outputs, and we can sort of become aware of some of the issues. So this is a robot that we actually built in Marseille for demonstration. It's not a serious robot. It's built from a toy, European toy. It's like the French version of what is Märklin in German. I forgot the name of the French tool toy set. It has inside a PC, an embedded PC. It's like 20 years old. It was still, like a real cube. Today you would get that on just a single layer. And we had a couple of sensors, some distance sensors here for obstacle avoidance, which I'm not going to explain. And there are, in this case, there are microphones. We had other sensors as well. These would be somewhat directional microphones that were used to make phonotexes, to have this robot orient to sound sources. And this is what I'll explain. And let's first talk about how the field representing the direction of a sound source is linked to sensory inputs. So these sound sources are defined, take input from each microphone, and they're defined by the sensitivity cone of each microphone. So these microphones react to sound sources within a certain range from their long axis, and you can measure that empirically. And so roughly, it's modeled in the model on the robot by a Gaussian. The width of the Gaussian was roughly matched to the empirical sensitivity cone of those microphones, which was about plus minus 60 degrees, no, plus minus 30, so a total of 60 degrees opening. Very cheap microphones, so this not considered a feature. Usually microphones are supposed to be broader in sensitivity cone. So there are only 5 microphones on this system. So 5 sensor information of 5 numbers. I would drive a whole field with that. So the 5 numbers multiply each sensitivity cone, which provide input to the field. So for instance, if you have 2 sound sources, then some of these microphones are driven more, and so there's a less. You multiply these Gaussians, and that provides input to the field, and then the field will presumably create a peak over one location. For instance, I'll show you. It could be, let's select one of those 2 sound sources and conditions. So here's some concrete examples really from that robot. So we, in this first set of examples, we didn't allow the robot to move. They turned off the motors, and we just played sound to the robot coming from the loudspeaker. It was actually Vivaldi, so it was a very high frequency, good for these microphones, but fluctuating. So we were looking at stability, the system being able to deal with that. Here you see the raw inputs from the, just measured at the source, the superposition of the 5 microphone Gaussians. fluctuating here. And what actually happens here is that we increase the volume on the vivality just by hand. We increase the knob. And that's what happens here in time. You see the amplitude of that input increases slowly. And this is the field that this feeds into. And you see here, detection instability occurs here, a little delayed. These inputs are not enough, and then makes a decision, and the peak forms, and it suppresses activation somewhere else. And so that's an estimate of the direction to the sound source. So that will be detection. And then the field is able to make selections. So for instance, you have two sound sources here, sufficiently far from each other. And the field actually locks onto one of those and then actually suppresses the other one. So see, there's very little activation here, even though sometimes this peak here receives more input, but you make a selection decision and stabilize it over time. That's how you can suppress the distractor source of sound. That's actually useful for what engineers call robust estimation. So this was actually a single sound source, and we put some cardboard on the right side to make an echo. And so there is some sound here on the right, and we want to not take that into account when we're averaging. And that was achieved. The peak actually settles on the local maximum. That's where the peak is very stable, as you see, to that very fluctuating input. These peaks also track the input. So we move the loudspeaker across the auditory array, and the peak tracks that with a little delay. Well, it's dynamic in that sense. And we actually also implemented sustained activations of working memory for the field. So here is a sound source that was turned on and then turned off. And while it's on, there's a nice peak. And then this thing here in the back, that is the working memory. In this model, we actually lower the resting level. So we destabilize working memory on purpose to make it decay with the rationale that when the robot moves around, the working memory should stop having an effect at some point. And I'll show you that later in actual run on the robot. So that is the interface with sensory input. It may be very clear that there's nothing very difficult about that. So the field that defines a sound source can be very naturally connected even to this very crude sensory input, right? It's not a prerequisite for dynamic field theory to have high-dimensional, very robust kind of sound sources, sensory sources. This is enough to create a continuous estimate of where sound sources are, right? With these 5 microphones, we're able to continuously track a sound source, right? Quite good. So how do we actually make then behavior? How do we get the robot to move? And that's linking this peak now. We say there's a peak that estimates the direction of the sound source. How do we generate behavior out of that? Now that's a whole chapter, it's a sort of whole line of research in my life on how to do motor. Now with the robot, it's much simpler. And I would just want to focus on this one aspect. So the idea would be that the peak sort of specifies somehow what the value, the motor value, how do we realize that? And there are 2 challenges in there. One is that actual motor behavior always involves some kind of stability issue. Any control engineer knows that. You have to create a stable state for the system in order for that system to consistently really reach the target behavior. And the other is essentially the transition from a space code, a localization of a peak to a rate code. So ultimately, in the nervous system, you're driving some muscles, and the muscles are rate coded. That is, more firing will drive the muscles more effectively. How's that done? And so I'll hint briefly at both solutions. The first is relatively straightforward. So here's a proposal that we developed actually independently years ago of how to drive essentially sort of navigation behavior, so moving in the plane. The idea would be you have a vehicle, you have a heading direction, there's a heading direction to some fixed axis, like going north or going south, let's say. And see, in the moment, I see you don't need a compass for that. And you know where the target is, at which angle it is, and then what you want to do is make that heading converges to the target. You can do that by directing also in a dynamics, we call this a behavioral dynamics, where the rate of change of turning is a function of, rate of change of heading is a function of heading. So and the attractor is at that target heading. And so if you're heading to the right, your negative rate of change converge, heading to the left, positive rate of change converge. So this will attract your heading into the heading to the target. And that somewhat ad hoc method turned out to describe very well how humans locomote. So some people whom I worked with at the time, Bill Warren and someone called Fajan, did this in a virtual reality lab. They exposed people to targets that suddenly appeared and obstacles, and they found this sort of turning rate, again, as function of heading, and you see sort of the dynamics here, right? The attractor here, and there's a repeller here for the obstacle, and they model that exactly. So in the same style as we do, there's some subtlety about first versus second order, and found that that describes well how humans navigate. And there's also some neural evidence for heading direction as a relevant variable. Some of you might know that there is some evidence for head orientation cells in rats that navigate in an environment, and their head orientation actually predicts their movement. So it's a measure of heading direction. And in fact, there is the current theory of that is that there is a peak of activation in a field that's very much the same kind of approach, different community. So they don't, it's slightly different language, but there is a peak of activation in a population of neurons that represent heading direction or head direction. And that peak actually predicts then the update of the animal's estimate of where it is. So roughly the idea would be that when it's heading a certain direction, its current estimate of where it is then moved by that representation or neural representation of heading to predict that it will be at some other location. Well, if there is no current heading direction, then it is not moved. And so that's a whole literature that I'm not reviewing here so quickly, but it's certainly quite consistent with our style of thinking. So technically in this robot, again, what we then want to do is we want to use this peak to provide the attractor for the heading direction. And that's an interesting wrinkle or different thought, because when people think about neural activation and population code, they often think of the activity of the sigmoid activity as something like probability density, of saying, okay, what I really need to do is compute like a theoretical mean. I need to see where, if you just take this positive part, I need to know where is the center of gravity, let's say, of this this peak. So this would be a formula for how you would do that. That would be the peak position estimated as a mean, phi times this as a probability density, and this is the normalization. It's important to do the normalization, right? If the total peak was smaller, if you just imply this formula, you will get it without the normalization, you would just get a smaller number. If it's just larger, you get a larger number. So to get the right number, you have to normalize it. And of course, that normalization is problematic, right? Because what happens if you have no peak, right? Are you going to divide by 0, or what happens? Turns out, if you think about this and not reading the value, but actually creating a behavioral attractor, then it doesn't involve that normalization problem. So what you want is you want, when there's a peak, to be in a behavioral dynamics that has an attractor, exactly this value. When there is no peak, just neutral contribution, so rate of change 0. So you have like marginally stable, any heading will work. And that turns out to be very easy to realize. And so the idea is that you're saying you want this will be a dynamical system, phi dot equals minus phi minus the peak position. That would have an attractor at the peak position, would be the linear dynamics. And you want the slope of that linear dynamics to be 0 when there is no peak. So this is the mass of activation in the peak. When this is 0, then you will get a 0 slope. When this is not 0, you will get exactly this kind of dynamics. Now, if you look at that, you insert the peak here, you see then you're multiplying. Remember, the peak has this thing in the denominator, and so you're multiplying with that and canceling that term. So this term cancels against the term in here. So then you're left with phi times this total mass, and then here you're left with phi times sigmoid. This is this term here times the sigmoid. This is times the sigmoid, and if you resort these terms, this is what emerges from that. So this means essentially that every location in the field phi prime specifies a little attractor, a minus phi prime, right? This little attractor with a negative slope, and the weight of that attractor is the current phi ring. So you're specifying attractors rather than states. And that turns out, no, that works. That's what this system does. There is actually some sound there, which you might hear through my microphone, perhaps. This is the Vivaldi. And here, see, the system goes to an echo. There's a sound coming out of the store, but it goes to the echo, makes a selection decision. That was wrong. But then the echo isn't stable over time. So as the angle changes, it will ultimately find the orientation and moves in here. I'll shorten this a little bit. We also have obstacle avoidance that allows this thing to go through here. And then actually, there is the loudspeaker here, and the obstacle avoidance enables the system to still turn away from the sound source and ultimately find its way, and then ends up in front of that vehicle. So this is a demo that so in this demo, the everything is neurodynamics or behavioral dynamics. So there is no algorithm. It's just actually a very small program that just implements that neural field, and then it's coupling to the heading direction. No, it's really the first instance of a purely autonomous neurodynamic architecture. So briefly, the other aspect is that you actually have muscles, and the descending activation is rate coded and temporally structured. So that's because locomotion is not the only thing that we do, of course. That's a much more complicated thing. The upshot is that somewhere in the brain, rate coded stuff is generated. That's not just heading. So for instance, this is motor cortex activation, and you look at the length of the population vector, which is the size of this population peak I just showed you, and it's found to be predictive of the speed of the hand. And there's some kind of notion that if you generate a time course like that in a neural oscillator network, and the motor cortex is supposed to be an oscillator, it's actually an active transit that just makes one activation, then that would drive would be a velocity signal that drives the hand signal. We model things like that. And you can think of big neural field models that have banks of such oscillators as the time generating kind of systems. And then they will, project onto the muscles. There's a whole problem of how that happens, called the degree of freedom problem. It's a complicated problem that, for instance, Lukas Biltam and my team is working on. And then you still have to be aware that muscles have reflex loops. And so they're actually little dynamical systems. Each muscle has a stable state, which is stabilized by a reflex. This little peripheral reflex loop makes for postural stability. And therefore, what you need to do is shift the attractor of that network. So for instance, initial level of activation is one attractor, and then after the movement, you have a different level of attraction. And that shift is caused by the descending signal. So clearly, that's not something you understand, but I'm just saying there is a way of filling in that gap between the peaks, then ultimately some muscle being activated. But it's a whole field that works on filling that gap. And in that field, it's not just like in the vehicle case or the hippocampal navigation case. It's entails timing, time courses, prediction, and stuff like that. More complicated. Okay, so I conclude today's lecture with a little outlook by saying that sensory motor cognition that is obtained from neural fields that are coupled to the sensory surfaces and act on the motor surfaces and so on can deliver some of these elements of cognitive function. So detection, selection, working memories are examples I concretely highlighted. I showed you a little bit how that can be be linked to behavioral decision making. And so tomorrow I'll be begin the voyage up toward real cognition. So far it was really just sort of decision making, really sensory motor decision making, very, very low level. But we'll see that with just some added ingredients, we can quickly get to real cognition. So we'll end tomorrow on a purely mental act, where there's no movement involved and actually no perception involved. We just imagine everything. There will be the high point where we've really moved from sensory motor to real cognition, but we do it in the same style, using the same concepts. That will be the outlook on that. And with this, I close then this core lecture.